All right. Just gonna let folks start to come in. It's fun to, and for the participants coming in, I'm just gonna like provide a narrative as to how the number of participants that have been waiting when they come in. So give folks a few minutes to just join us. All right. We are at about 52, so I'm going to get started. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. In the interest of time, I'm going to just jump right on ahead in and get started. And I'd like to let everyone know that this conversation is being recorded, and we will share the video via email and on our blog on the site, ggwash.org, in the next few weeks. Thank you so much for spending the next hour with us. My name is Ron Thompson, and I'm Greater Washington's Transportation Equity Organizer. And so much of my work is done with the aim of not just sprinkling the word equity around like parsley, that we see happen so often, unfortunately, in a lot of areas of work, and that we're actually taking the time to equitify transportation policy and planning in the urban space in the Greater Washington region. To expand briefly on this food analogy, truly equitifying our work means infusing our most marginalized communities into how we develop and discuss policy. So understanding that when we talk about injecting equity, more often than not, we're talking about some harm that has been done to communities of color, to the poor, to our disabled neighbors and communities, and to so many of those other marginalized communities that have been kept out of opportunity in so many spaces throughout our country and throughout our society. So at the end of this event, I hope that you all leave with a greater understanding of the Black experience as the subject of tonight's conversation is about as we move through spaces, not just in the Greater Washington region, but we are also joined by someone from the Midwest. So you'll hear a lot about the Black experience from a kind of broader lens. I also want to thank our partners at Transit Center. With their financial support, we have been able to put on a series of events, including this one, focused on the bus and making it better for all riders. Amid the ongoing pandemic, Transit Center has been at the forefront of the fight for our most vulnerable transit riders. And so I just again want to thank you all for allowing GGWash to be a part of those events and support as a part of those efforts and supporting this event. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our phenomenal panel. And so I will start from with Veronica Davis and William Washburn, Jerome Horn, and Kyle Reeder. And I'll give them an opportunity to introduce themselves more in detail. Or let me take a step back. Veronica Davis is the co-founder and co-principal of Nspiregreen. Kyle Reeder is the co-lead of Prince George's County's Bike and Pedestrian Advisory Committee. William Washburn is a former planner with the District of Columbia's Office of Planning and Prince George's County's Planning Department. And Jerome Horn is a writer, experience specialist at Indigo. Their official name of Indigo is the Indianapolis Public Transportation Corporation, which operates the city of Indianapolis's bus system. And so with that, I want to open up to our panelists, and starting with Veronica, if you could tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to be interested in transportation and urbanist issues.
Thank you, Ron, for having me on this panel. I'm really excited. It's a really great vibe between all the panelists. So as Ron said, my name is Veronica Davis. I am a plan engineer. So I have a civil engineering background and a planning background. I was born into transportation. My mom went into labor when my dad worked for UMTA, now the Federal Transit Administration. So that's how my life started. And so both of my parents were in transportation. My mom worked for New York City Transit. My dad worked for FTA's predecessor, as well as the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and Sealand, which then got bought by CSX. So I literally was born into it. But from a bus perspective, you know, for me, it was moving into the District of Columbia. I moved into DC in 2005, and I picked my neighborhood specifically because there was a bus that took me directly from my neighborhood to work for $1.10. So that goes to show how long ago that was. And so I am a huge proponent of the bus. I live by bus and metro now, but bus is my preference. So that's how I got in it. And I guess I'm popcorning it to Mr. Washburn.
You know, I think ever since I was a kid, I was fascinated by things that moved, okay? Particularly trains, also rocket ships, planes, cars. And then going through high school, I started getting interested in planning because that was the early 60s. And there are a lot of things that were starting to happen on the ground in the United States with the civil rights movement and all of the turmoil that was going on, particularly in the South, particularly where I was in Nashville, because Nashville, of course, was the city where John Lewis first made his major mark as a civil rights advocate. But it was at that point that I started getting more interested in urban planning, because I saw it as an opportunity, seeing how Black people were left out of the equation when it came to shaping how cities and towns look and who benefits from how things are run in those communities. And so that's where I obtained a civil engineering degree, and then later a planning degree, like Veronica. And I did a lot of writing, like, term papers dealing with the disparities in planning and transportation, how the highways were bulldozed through communities of color, and those kinds of things. And that was reflected through my 40-odd years of working as a planner, particularly transportation planning, and particularly when I was working in Prince George's County. I became very much involved in the making of plans for trans-oriented development around metro stations. And so I guess that experience has shaped the way that I look at things, and where I am now as a retired planner. You might say I picked up the activist mantle again, because I see we just really have to make a different mark on where Black communities are going to be when COVID-19 disappears. Are we going to have a transit system that serves people of color? And what are our communities going to look like? Because people can talk about telework and autonomous vehicles, but that's not doing anything for people who look like us. Because most of us work jobs where we can't telecommute. So that's basically it.
Thank you for that, Mr. Washburn. I want to go to Jerome, and Jerome, you could tell us about yourself and how you got into transportation and your work at Indigo.
Well, hello, everyone. Once again, I'm Jerome Horn, excited to be here on this panel, and I work for Indigo, the transit system for Indianapolis. I am our ridership experience specialist, and that title means everything and nothing at all. But see, I focus on the customer journey of riding transit. So that's anything from thinking about wayfinding, the design of our maps and signage, technology integration, how people can get real-time information about tracking their buses, customer feedback, making sure that we're working on programs to set up consistent feedback loops with our customers to make sure that we're understanding what they want and how they're interacting and using the system. And I'm someone that I ride our system every day, or at least pre-COVID, I was riding every day. But I ride, bike, and walk through many parts of the city, so I'm very in tune and kind of on the ground with the different experiences of riding the bus and using transit and existing in public space as a Black person. My interest in transit really goes all the way back to when I was a child. I've always been fascinated by trains and buses. I'm originally from Baltimore, so not too far away from DC. You know, I grew up with some family members with early exposure to riding the light rail, subway, and buses in Baltimore, and MARC train down to DC, and riding Metro Rail in DC. And I just always was so really into trains, watching Thomas the Tank Engine and whatnot. I think really the biggest thing is when I was 10 years old, I sent my first email with the help of my dad, and it was to the CEO of MTA Maryland at that time. And I asked him, how could I get your job when I grow up? So when I was 10 years old, I was thinking about being a transit CEO, and you know, somehow maybe I'm on my way there, but that's kind of my fascination. And you may have noticed behind me, I have a lot of bus stop signs and transit models. I'm a huge transit nerd. So I don't just work in the field, but it's a true passion of mine.
Thank you, Jerome. And I don't think I don't know if those are model buses. I know that there are like model train connoisseurs, but I don't think I've ever seen model buses. And I think it is a hobby that during this pandemic I need to get into. So thank you for sharing that image with us. And lastly, I wanted to go to Kyle Reeder. If you could tell us how you got into transportation and urban issues, and what inspired you to
good evening, everyone. My name is Kyle Reeder. I am a lifelong resident of Prince George's County. I live in Capitol Heights, just outside of the DC Maryland border. For my day job, I am a project manager with the federal government, supporting the delivery of real estate projects in the region. I also am a market manager at a local farmers market, but more relevantly, I am the co-lead of the Prince George's County Bike and Pedestrian Advisory Committee under the direction of the Department of Public Works and Transportation. I grew up in a majority Black middle-class community here in Prince George's County, where the closest bus stop was probably a mile away. And so my first interaction probably with the bus was with our public schools, where I was bused maybe 2 hours, where I had an overall 4-hour commute to and from school. And so on that commute, I spent a lot of time just looking out the window, just appreciating how people got to and from wherever they were going. And so on top of that, I spent a lot of time playing SimCity, which is a software that allows people to develop their own cities. And so that probably also contributes to my interest in transit and the relationship between transit and how communities are developed. And when I moved closer into the Beltway, or more into closer to DC, I noticed a couple of issues in my community around transit, and I became more involved and vocal in those aspects that I'm looking forward to talking about today. And yeah, that's just a little bit about who I am.
Thanks. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, everyone, for those introductions. And a lot of what everyone said resonates with me and in my experience in this development and becoming more interested in this field. But I wanted to go back to Mr. Washburn. You started talking about Nashville and John Lewis, and I was thinking about the kind of integral or the kind of interconnectedness of the civil rights movement with transportation. And so the question that I can start with you is, how has transportation been used to advance racist policy? Philip Randolph famously said, he was the founder and first president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and a key organizer in the March on Washington, said, "Justice is never given. It is exacted, and the struggle must be continuous for freedom. It is never a final act, but a continuing and evolving process to higher and higher levels of human, social, economic, political, and religious relationship." And so going back to the question, how has transportation been used to advance racist policy? Could you talk about that for our guests? our viewers? Oh.
Not centuries. And, you know, many of the people who are listening today, some of the older folks like myself, remember the kickoff of the civil rights movement was the Montgomery Bus Boycott, okay, back in the mid-50s, because basically transportation systems were used to define communities. And when we started dealing with the highways and the railroads, it was to cut communities off from other parts of the city. And those communities had people who were pushed onto those properties because they were environmentally threatened properties, okay? And so, for example, with the interstate highways, the National Defense Highways, as they were called, when Dwight Eisenhower got the idea for those roads from when he was over the Allied troops during the Second World War. And he saw the Autobahns in Germany and how they were used to move military around. Well, if you visit Germany and you drive on those Autobahns, none of them goes into a city. None of those Autobahns goes into a city. And it was not Eisenhower's original intent to have those interstate highways cutting the cities up. But what happened is you had urban renewal going at the time, and a big part of urban renewal was communities of color being defined as slums. And so then the natural answer then is slum clearance. And so you have communities knocked down and replaced by luxury housing and hotels and commercial places. I mean, you go to Nashville, for example, my hometown, there used to be a Black community wrapped around Capitol Hill, okay? When the state started designing the highways, they planned the community, they planned those highways to go through the Black communities because they were sitting on the cheapest land. But it also served the purpose of getting rid of quote unquote slums. And so you had Interstate 40 to get plowed through the biggest business district in North Nashville, Jefferson Street, okay? So these highways have been used to divide and isolate communities because they have been commuter highways. You go to any big major city in this country and you see where the highways are built and they go through communities of color. And so that is how they have perpetuated white supremacy and policies that have, that have made other people rich at our expense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. And we have to look at this, we have to look at these dynamics as operating around race and economics, class, and it all comes together.
Yeah.
It all comes together.
And I wanted to get to you, Veronica. So if I kind of going back, the railroads, when we think about separate but equal,
mm-hmm.
Can you talk about where that comes from and its ties to transportation policy? And then I know you want to follow that with your other point.
You asking me?
Oh no, I'm sorry, Veronica.
No, I'm gonna leave that to Mr. Washburn. He's a historian. I don't want to, get my hands slapped. I say a date wrong or a name wrong, but I'm gonna follow up. So go ahead, Mr. Washburn. I defer to my elder.
Okay. Well, it goes back to how America was set up. Okay, the fact that it was set up as a capitalist system built on a foundation of racial hierarchy. Okay. And in fact, it was slavery that funded the beginning of capitalism in this country. Okay, and that has never really changed. I think with how these transportation systems have been set up and how they have impacted communities, as I said again, it's always been about certain interests making money. There was a lot of money to be made at one time from the railroads, and the railroads were set up according to these class and racial lines. I mean, Plessy versus Ferguson had to do with a brother trying to get a seat on a segregated streetcar in New Orleans. Okay, and so these dynamics have simply been carried forth, and we can see it in how transit systems that primarily serve communities of color are seen as throwaways. And this is just a challenge that we face now.
I'm going to get a question to Jerome and Kyle, but I did want to share this news to everyone watching and also get back to Veronica. Speaking of railways and railroads, Senator Amtrak Joe Biden, former vice president, has picked Kamala Harris to be his VP should he win. So history has been made during this conversation about history.
That was the only choice that makes sense.
Right.
Okay. So Veronica, I wanted to go to you and to get your thoughts.
Yeah, so it was two things I wanted to say about that. You know, one, I wanted to give a very personal, I think a lot of times we talk about displacement and things of that, particularly when it comes to Black community and transportation. For me, it's extremely personal. My grandparents lost their house to build the I-10 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So my mom was, you know, as I said, that's where my people's from. You know, but my mom, you know, my grandparents had a house right next to my great-grandmother. And so they took my grandparents' house in order to build the highway. They left my great-grandmother's house. So she literally had the highway overpass over her house. And I remember as a child trying to figure out, why is her house underneath like who would build a house underneath the highway overpass, when I realized the highway overpass was built over her. And so the disruption that it made, you know, to my family. So my great-grandmother, who used to be able to just go out her back door and see her grandkids, now has to travel across the city in order to see her grandkids. So the displacement part of it is, there's real stories. You know, my you know, mom still can talk about it and recall it as if it happened yesterday. And then even when we look here, bringing it home to the District of Columbia, you know, when we look at, it's interesting, you have the environmentalists that are like, oh, why don't the Black people east of the Anacostia River connect with the Anacostia River? Like, we should bring them to the river. And it's like, but they were intentionally disconnected from the river. Like, it's really interesting to hear the history of Berry Farm and some of the other communities where people talked about going to the river and fishing and being able to interact, and then a highway was built. And so it's this interesting thing that we deal with now as planners. And I think it's a tension that all Black planners kind of face in this work, because it's like, we're a planner and we know these technical things, but we still Black, right? Like, it's like our Blackness we can't leave behind. And, you know, and it's interesting that we hear all these things of like, oh, Black people should do all these things. And it's like, well, we did do those things and you took it away. And then now you want to pay for this campaign to get us to do it again, you know? So that's what I had to add.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I wanted to go to you, Jerome. I know, and this is, I hope that this, you know, this question, it's something that we ought to face as we think about kind of like the political dynamics of things. But you work in Indianapolis, a major city that moves differently probably than a lot of the rural and suburban parts of Indiana. It is a red state. You all have a Republican governor, a Republican legislature. And as early in March of this year, you all, Indigo, faced proposed budget cuts. And now we're seeing, you know, the importance of public transit, particularly the bus. What role would you say race has played in kind of dictating and determining the future and present course of the bus in Indianapolis and elsewhere?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. You know, certainly, I think in a more general sense, you know, the bus has, particularly in the United States, has been viewed as lesser than, or as a mode of last resort or choice, or, you know, there's this maybe thought process that, oh, well, we'll give them something and they'll ride it anyway because they have no choice. And so, you know, there's a certain stigma even associated with the bus, who rides the bus and who the bus is for. And I think that has certainly been something that has played out and has been used, you know, through history, but even more so recently, I'd say in the last, you know, ever since the highways were built and we had white flight and people went out to the suburbs, and, you know, what was left in cities, and we had, you know, were largely people of color, Black people, you know, and, you know, we kind of begin to see sort of a dynamic shift on who was riding the bus. And I think that there has kind of been this sort of cloud hanging over bus systems, that the bus has not been given the same priority and treatment as, you know, some you know, rail systems, commuter buses, things like that. And so the fixed route local bus in cities has certainly you know, had some difficulties. I think over the last few years, we've started to see cities and communities around the country begin to realize that it is the humble bus that is really the workhorse of transit systems. You know, rail systems don't go everywhere. BRT lines aren't being built everywhere. But, you know, really serving the neighborhoods that people, particularly low income Black people, are in, you know, we're beginning to see some shift and recognition that we need to prioritize the bus and make some better investments there.
And so I guess to follow up, my next question would be, and you covered this in part, what role has race played in the disinvestment and underinvestment in our nation's bus systems? You talked about kind of the shift in our neighborhoods with largely white communities leaving to the suburbs, no longer using the bus, coming back into cities via the highways. Is that a dynamic where you have, as I said, in Indianapolis, you all had the experience of just a few months ago having the state Senate propose cuts to the budget. What role do you think race plays in the disinvestment and underinvestment of our nation's bus systems? How big of a role do you think it plays?
Yeah, I certainly think it is a factor. I mean, it is, as we have mentioned, as Veronica and Mr. Washburn had mentioned, transportation has been used as a tool to, you know, create barriers and or restrict where people can go or what they have access to. And I think that it is anecdotally, you know, and evidence also, but fair to say that the bus systems have probably been intentionally not invested in as much as they needed to be, because, you know, providing better service, better frequency, better hours, you know, buses, you know, providing access to certain parts of the community that would allow people to have that access to opportunity. And so where the bus routes go, you know, that's what somebody can get to, that's who somebody can meet, that's what somebody can do. And I think that limiting, you know, frequency, limiting service span, you know, one of the issues that we know especially with COVID, this has been exposed is, you know, we talk about the essential worker. The essential workers have always been essential. They were essential before the pandemic. You know, providing limited late night service or no late night service, or not having weekend hours. And we see this in, you know, particularly smaller cities like my own, though we've been started making some progress there. But weekend service, especially, is really important. And that's something that's been lacking in a lot of systems with people that work, you know, we're a 24/7 economy, and there are plenty of people that work second and third shifts that need to be able to get to and from work reliably and safely, and not investing in those. I think there's been some definitely some racial motivation behind that.
Yeah. Kyle, and I think I wanted to come to you because I think that's an important that last bit about frequency and that weekend service in Prince George's County, which is majority Black, one of the wealthiest Black counties. You all have some of the in the region, to be quite frank, the kind of least frequent, particularly in the week, but especially on the weekends and the evenings. You will all particularly have really poor bus service. What do you think has contributed to the level of service in Prince George's County? Is it folks in Annapolis? Is it a lack of buy-in in the community? What do you think is the issue with why bus service is so infrequent out there?
Jerome hit on a point in mentioning white flight, and particularly in Prince George's County, where we are a predominantly African-American county, a very affluent county. I think it was more in our county a middle-class flight, right? Where for those who aren't familiar with the dynamics, where we have the inside of the Beltway, where we're more urbanized and generally more lower income, and then outside of the Beltway, where there's more suburbia, more wealth. The middle-class Black community ultimately migrated from our urban center core of the District of Columbia and inside the Beltway to outside communities outside of the Beltway, like the Woodmores and Fort Washingtons. And then that transfer of wealth from our communities inside the Beltway to outside of the Beltway, with folks having government jobs and depending more so not on buses to get around, but their cars, essentially shifted the priorities of past administrations if most people were driving into work, there wasn't necessarily a need to invest in buses, and particularly to your point, Ron, of just weekend services not being as frequent as weekday services, and our weekday services not being as strong. That's something that our county, which is particularly sprawled out and huge and people living all over, we're suffering from decisions that revolved around the car, in terms of we got these sprawled out communities and people are all over the place. We're very car dependent. We have a Republican governor who has literally shifted funds from transit to building more highways, and in particular has shifted those funds to projects that the Washington Post has reported on, shifted the projects that are around particular properties that he owns. And so there has been historically, in particular in Maryland, not an appetite to serve those communities and urban centers. The rail line in particular in Baltimore was cut as a result of shifting those funds from mass transit to highway constructions. And, a lot of communities, particularly low income and particularly Black, suffer, right? And that's kind of essentially, that shift in priority of focus of, those who pay taxes are catching the car to work. They aren't catching the buses. And as Mr. Washburn has said, Jerome said, a lot of the essential workers that are still going to work in COVID rely on bus transit to get to and from work, right? And so, we are experiencing the impact of those poor decisions in the past, and this current time, and COVID has exacerbated the consequences of those poor decisions.
Mr. Washburn, I know that you have a kind of intimate understanding of some of what Kyle was talking about with bus service and rail and kind of the shift in the demographics. So could you talk a bit about the attitudes toward bus in Prince George's County?
Well, thing I noticed when I was working in Prince George's County was the stigma that a lot of older Black homeowners, I guess in one sense, refugees from the district, okay, had not only around transit, but around affordable housing. And it got in the way of our planning for transit-oriented development, because when you talk to some of these older homeowners, all they could see was, quote unquote, the projects. okay? And then when you look at the attitudes around public transit, particularly bus transit, I always had an issue about why the county would name its service the bus, okay? Because I always felt that the very name was a kind of a put down, and that the counties, just didn't have a constituency that was organized enough for it to take bus service seriously, okay? But it also has something to do with the fact that that the county seat, and is located in a town outside the Beltway that until probably 15, 20 years ago didn't even have bus service. Because the people who were in charge of the county government then, they didn't want to see Black folks from quote unquote the projects, DC, coming out and busting into their homes and taking TVs, okay? So it was that kind of mentality. And I think it shows in the fact that the county treats its bus service as a throwaway, an afterthought.
Yeah.
And that is not going to change until we as a Black community, particularly those of us who call ourselves middle class or upperly mobile or whatever we want to call ourselves, deal with our own attitudes around Black folks who are less economically well off than we are.
Yeah.
Because let me tell you this, the Black middle class in Washington, DC started leaving the city in the 70s. White people didn't push them out. White people didn't push them out. They didn't want to live around other Black folks. And they associated living in a predominantly Black community with high crime. And that is one reason why Prince George's County and DeKalb County down in metro Atlanta, these are very wealthy, predominantly Black counties, but their governments are impoverished. And the impoverishment impacts bus service, it impacts housing, it impacts everything.
Speak on that, Mr. Washburn.
And I wanted to say, and thank you for that, for kind of that education. I wanted to go back to Jerome because I know you wanted to make a point into you kind of see how what you talked about, it's experienced in a lot of places. So I had another question for you, and we did in the span of that conversation talk about COVID, and you're working inside of a transit agency during this ongoing health crisis. Can you tell us about how COVID-19 has impacted Indigo in terms of ridership and finances?
Yeah, so for our particular situation in Indianapolis, we saw our ridership drop about half, about 50%. So not quite as severe as maybe some other cities and communities, but part of that is by and large that the majority of our ridership were those that are essential workers, the people that, were still needed to be able to use the bus system to go to work. We took a lot of the kind of best practices from other cities where we instituted rear door boarding. We went to blocking off the area near the front operator, installing plexiglass shields to help protect the operator, and reducing capacity on buses. And then we went down to a Saturday schedule, but we did keep all of our routes running. Now, I think that, one thing that should be talked about is, if we have buses that have reduced capacity and we're running on a reduced schedule, that can lead to situations where perhaps, the buses could reach capacity sooner. Someone might have to wait for a bus. And depending on how frequently that bus is running, that could, potentially leaving someone having to wait for the next bus. And also just making sure that we are protecting our operators has been a challenge. That's a challenge for every transit agency. We were fortunate that about a month ago or so, we got a mask requirement here. And so that's been really helpful in terms of making riders and our operators feel more comfortable. But certainly for a lot of systems around the country, there were situations where bus routes were cut and are still cut. And it's a question of whether or not those are going to be restored. Mm. And, I think that, a lot of cities, particularly I know in San Francisco and Atlanta, a lot of service was cut, and, who was cut off, and when is that service, going to be put back? And I think that there are definitely a lot of equity concerns around that. And a lot of systems saw a big ridership decline in their commuter and maybe express bus service. And, those are by and large people that could work from home, or telecommute. And I think that for transit agencies, reevaluating and thinking about some of the impacts of COVID, perhaps if we're not going to see all of those commuters come back, then I think it's a good opportunity to look at, hey, how do you redistribute some of that funding and some of those resources that were dedicated to those commuter service or park and ride services to go back to the local bus fleet and increase service in places where, we know people may be more dependent on transit and we need more resources. In terms of funding, all transit agencies are looking at reduced funding from, whether it's a local tax source or income tax or property tax, whatever. Fares, of course, are down. A lot of transit agencies had eliminated fares for a little while. Some have begun to reinstate them, but still with less riders, certainly that is an impact. And we're having to look at, how do we make sure that we keep the agency running as much as we can, but having to also make some tough decisions about service levels. And each community is different depending on the city. Some cities are in better situations than others, but certainly it's going to be a challenge. And I think that we need to make sure that the conversation is aimed around who are we serving and who's going to, with service that remains or service that gets restored, prioritizing that to be in the places that really need transit.
Hey, Ron, can I jump in real quick?
Sure. And I want to get to Veronica, but yes.
All right. Just real quick, I just wanted to add, somebody in the comments had mentioned how we value Black spaces versus white spaces. And I think that's a conversation in itself that can take an hour, right? And to Mr. Washburn's point, I think historically Prince George's County has undervalued the bus because they associated the bus with low income. Middle-class people of all backgrounds have typically wanted to steer away from low income because in our capitalist society, the amenities are where the middle class and upper class reside. And I think it's important to mention that, I think Prince George's County, although suffering with a lot of challenges of past decisions, now understand the importance of of the bus, right? We understand that, because we're in COVID, Prince George's County has led the state in COVID cases because the essential workers that service the Washington region live in Prince George's County, right? They rely on the bus. They are the folks who've still been taking a bus when folks have the privilege of staying home. And I think this current administration with County Executive Angela Alsobrooks and her Department of Public Works and Transportation Agency recognized the need of making sure that these systems like the bus system are funded. And so I know over this past summer in the midst of COVID, while recognizing that these essential workers are still going to work, made sure that the frequency of the buses in inner Beltway communities were upkept and people were still able to get to and from work. And then I think as Jerome mentioned, we also adopted require face mask coverings to ride the bus. So although in the past we have had very bad historical decisions related to transit, I think that Prince George's County is now recognize the value in getting in the bus and are trying to make up for those bad decisions. And I know we have a long way to go, but I serve on the Department of Public Works and Transportation Bike and Pedestrian Committee, where these conversations are happening of how we can better connect our communities to these services. And I just thought it was important to mention that.
And thank you for that, Kyle. And as we all know, we all have a lot, even in places where we think we're doing well, we have a lot of change and growth to do. Veronica, I wanted to ask you, before I turned out to our audience's questions, in the midst of the pandemic, a lot of the kind of public engagement that transit agencies and other DOTs and other agencies that kind of do space-changing work, that has been interrupted. What would you say transit and transportation officials should be thinking about in terms of community engagement and these ever-changing circumstances, and what can be improved coming out of it once we are able to touch and talk to one another again?
Mm-hmm. I think that, as it relates to community engagement, people are going to have to be creative how to reach people. So one, we are seeing across the country in general, online engagement is up. So when there is a meeting that's online in the evening, people are, going when they, versus having to go somewhere in person, people can listen in from the convenience of their home. However, that still needs to be coupled with analog engagement, and then whether that's mailers, whether that's phone calls, whether that's one of the things we're working on with the project is doing kind of advertorials, where it's not just about putting an ad about the project in the newspaper, because if I don't know what it is, I don't know what it is, but putting a little bit more description of what you're talking about, what are the options, what are the alternatives, so people can read it, like things that you would put on a fact sheet, put it in a newspaper that people read so that they can see it and then they can understand. So it is going to be about being creative of those budgets. It's about being intentional of those budgets. And even using, whether it is social media, very effectively to really target people in order to engage them. But not engaging isn't an excuse. And quite frankly, with some, not all, but some agencies don't really want to do engagement, right? So that's one of the challenges too, where in general, they didn't want to do it before. So now, this gives them an excuse to half-ass it. But I think we need to hold people to account and making sure that they are following, even just the law of Title VI, which I feel is the absolute bare minimum, because that's just, you have to consider, but I think, making sure that we're holding, these agencies to account, that they are engaging the community and that they are listening to the community.
And I wanted to also ask, and this is kind of related, but we've been seeing a lot recently where COVID-19 has presented a lot of opportunities with open road space. We talked a lot at the beginning about highways and roads, and we have a lot of excess road capacity during this time. And in the face of that, a lot of advocates and some officials with inside of transportation, DOTs, transit agencies, have pushed for kind of, I don't want to call them radical, but changes to the space. And some people have pushed back and said, we may need to slow down a bit. Can you talk a bit about, and you mentioned this, like the intentionality and saying that we do have to sometimes just sit and listen to people even though we don't want to. Can you talk about if, where the concern among some, from what I've seen and from what others may have seen, largely Black people of color, planners and urbanists saying, we're moving a bit too fast as we talk about changing the road space to be more bike and ped and walk friendly?
So it's complicated. So I tell you, as someone who has been in the trenches, who has battle wounds from all the above, it's really complicated. And so, to unpack a little bit of it, you know, some of it is, it's not that Black communities don't want bike lanes, but how are you talking to me about a bike lane and my bus isn't showing up on time, right? Like, I'm waiting for the bus. I've asked you for the bus. Or, you know, you go in some communities, they're like, in 1963, we asked for a stop sign. And you like, you know? And so how do you talk about new infrastructure when people haven't even had their just base needs met or concerns met? So I think that's part of it. And that's part of the rejection of, you know, maybe new things. It's not that Black people don't want it, is that you haven't even addressed I have a pothole in front of my house. Like, how do I trust you to deliver this other thing on time? So that's part of it. And then I will say, you know, to just give a peek behind the little, you know, the Black cookout curtain, I think within Black people, there's levels to us, right? We are not a monolithic group. And, you know, we're kind of talking around it, but, you know, a lot of us have, you know, we have this I've arrived, right? And so I've arrived is I put in the work, I went to school, I got my money, I got my coins. And so now I have my big house in Prince George's County, I got my Mercedes, and this is what I work for. And this is a symbol of my hard work, and I've arrived, and now you want me to get on a bike, you know? And so I think that there's that kind of thing that we don't really grapple with within the Black community of our view of success and all of those things. And so that plays into the dynamic too of, and even with conversations around the bus, why would I ride the bus? I worked hard to get to where I am, so I wouldn't have to ride the bus. And a lot of times, you know, when you talk to people, you know, even in Prince George's County, they'll say, I grew up in DC, ride the bus, you know? And so I think that kind of plays into it too. So sometimes it's really about getting to, you know, I always say, my husband jokes, the root of the root. Like, what is the root of the root? In having some of these conversations.
Yeah, I joke with my mother because she over the course of years, she commutes from DC to Albany to work at Montgomery Medical Center, and she doesn't like the driving commute, but she has said for many years, I'm not getting back on the bus. It's that back on, and I agree that we definitely need to confront that. You know, why do we see the bus as this backward step? I wanted to get to some questions that folks that we have from the audience. One of our attendees wrote, I think a lot about what it would mean for us to treat buses and transit infrastructure the same way we do roads right now, i.e. X number of people take this bus every day and are deserving of better service, whether or not they organize for it. But that may risk assuming the needs of those riders who in places like DC are majority Black or in Prince George's County. Do you think there's, or in any majority Black municipality, do you think there's a role for this kind of implied demand for bus lanes, BRT, or even bus shelters? You know, that's sometimes a thing where there has to be certain metrics met and then things are done before a bus shelter is built. Do you think there's a role for this kind of implied demand for improved bus facilities without suppressing the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color?
So I'll start from the transit agency perspective. You know, I think one of the biggest things that needs to change is the allocation of funding. You know, that's both from a federal, state, and local level, just for transit in general. You know, more funding so that particularly for bus service, so that buses can be given the priority and treatment that they should. So that's one of the biggest components that I think will help make that you know, possible to do. It is true that, especially when it comes to bus stops and which stop gets a shelter or a bench or a trash can, you know, a lot of agencies have thresholds of, you know, we need to have X number of boardings a day, and to have a shelter, this needs to be, you know, public right of way, or if it's a private property, we have to negotiate with the property owner, or it may not be possible. There are a lot of hurdles that have to be jumped through, but I do think that there definitely should be you know, just a better minimum standard of what a bus stop should be, and the resources and amenities that are allocated to buses. But a lot of that, I think, is going to have to come from, you know, funding overall. We need more funding for transit, and we need to specifically earmark and allocate funding to go towards bus service.
Yeah. Mr. Washburn.
You know, I think in addition to that, I'm glad Jerome brought up the issue of allocation of funding because this society's funding for roads versus transit has always been lopsided, okay? The federal government wasn't even funding transit before the 60s. And, but the other part of this is, and this is something I think is a challenge for all of us, you know, transportation systems, whether it's bus service or trains or whatever, these are not things that exist in a vacuum. They exist in communities that are built out, that have housing and other kinds of uses, that have public spaces. And I think the one thing that happens that turns a lot of Black people off is that the planning processes tend to be rushed, and they tend to X the community out. This, which is why, for example, Nashville tried to put transit planning in place, but because they rushed it, because they didn't deal with the grassroots, when when it came time to get the money, their ducks weren't in line. And so, and I think for Black people ourselves is we need to start imagining what our communities are going to look like, not just simply when COVID is finally taken care of by a federal government that knows what it's doing, okay? But, you know, going into the future, I mean, I think at a minimum, we want our communities to be places where it is safe for children, the elderly, women, the physically challenged to be able to get around different places in the community and be safe, okay? And be safe. And that the streets have to serve all users, not just people sitting behind the wheel of a car or being driven in a car. Okay, so this is the big picture that we've got to fit all of these systems into. What kind of communities do we want to live in? Nobody's asking Black people that. And it's up to us, you know, particularly us as planners, but as Black folks who are engaged in just flipping the script, okay? and first getting some of the, you know, taking out the trash, which I hope everybody's going to do by November the 3rd, okay? But we have to have some kind of vision. I mean, I don't know how many people here saw Black Panther, but I was fascinated by how the vision of an advanced technological society built on African cultural roots. Okay, we have that in us, and I think we need to look more and more at having that kind of vision in mind as we go day to day in dealing with these challenges.
Yeah, and
Yes.
I agree. We are this is kind of putting out earlier. This conversation can go on for hours and hours and hours, especially with this panel. We are at 4:59, and I wanted to thank all of our panelists for taking the time to have this conversation, all of our attendees for taking the time to have this conversation. I wanted to leave with this conversation about making our work equitified. GGWash takes that very seriously, and over the last few months, we have been able to work with some DC-based organizations to start building an apparatus to have a conversation about equity in transportation policy. And we've put together a network called the DC Transportation Equity Network. So in the next few weeks, please be on the lookout for our launch and our announcement. And thank you to New Urban Mobility Alliance, the Natural Resources Defense Council, Hewlett Foundation, and Energy Foundation for making that work possible. I hope everyone enjoyed. Thank you to our panelists again for a really, really great conversation. If we didn't get to answer your question, we will do it in a follow-up post. This event will also be recorded and posted online, so you will have the opportunity to see it all again. Thank you, thank you, thank you, and everybody have a good evening.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Peace.
Everybody stay safe.
Stay safe.